Hello and welcome to a new episode of Interpreting India. From geopolitical complexities to economic uncertainties, India faces critical challenges in its quest for a more prominent role on the world stage. This season, we at Carnegie India continue to bring voices from India and around the world to examine the role of technology, the economy, and international security in shaping India's future. I am Charukeshi Bhatt, and today we're looking at the invisible infrastructure that powers the internet, subsea cables. Stretching over 1.5 million kilometers across ocean floors, they carry nearly 99% of global data traffic, underpinning everything from modern financial systems, cloud infrastructure, to the everyday digital services that we rely on. In that sense, they're not just economic lifelines, but critical strategic networks shaping how countries connect, compete, and grow in the digital age. While these networks have existed since the 1850s, their importance and also vulnerability has sharply increased. Alongside natural wear and tear and accidental damage, there has been a rise in deliberate disruptions, with incidents in regions like the Red Sea, the Baltic Sea, highlighting how outages can cascade into major economic and public service disruptions. For India, this comes at a moment of expanding digital demand, with data center capacity expected to grow dramatically in the coming years. As connectivity needs deepen, they will rest on secure and resilient subsea cable infrastructure, raising important questions about how countries like India engage with the global cable networks and how do they balance economic and strategic priorities and concerns. We'll unpack some of the key issues around these cable networks in today's episode. Joining us today to discuss this topic is Dr. Pooja Bhatt, Associate Professor and Director of the Pankaj Kumar Jha Center for Security Studies at the OP Jindal Global University. Dr. Bhatt is the author of The 9-Line, Deciphering the South China Sea Conundrum, and was a part of the Indian Navy history book titled A Decade of Transformation, the Indian Navy from 2011 to 21, which was released by the Honorable President in 2022. She works extensively on maritime issues, particularly in the Indo-Pacific and the South China Sea, besides also writing on defense and Asian security architecture. Her work on undersea cables has been published by a DFAT Australia-funded project at the Australia-India Institute and another co-authored one at the Institute for Security and Development Policy, Sweden. Dr. Bhatt has previously been associated with the Policy Planning and Research Division at the MEA as a consultant and at the Rashtriya Raksha University in Gandhinagar as a faculty for defense and strategic studies. Dr. Bhatt, we're delighted to have you on the podcast. Welcome to Interpreting India.
Hi, Charukeshi. Thank you for having me, and thank you, Carnegie, for initiating Conversation Submarine Cables, for which I'm very happy to be part of.
Thank you so much. So we'll dive right in. The Indo-Pacific is home to over half the world's internet users, and we have some of the fastest digitizing economies. We have some of the most strategically sensitive cable corridors in the region. Could you elaborate on the importance of subsea cables for the region from both an economic and strategic lens?
Okay, I think this is a very good question and a foundational question to start this conversation of subsea cables. 2-3 things I would want to start with. Firstly, subsea cables are nothing new of this decade or so. They have been into existence since late 18th century, since 1870s, 1880s. They have been always there. Only the thing is, what has the difference been over the years is the kind of usage that we have received in the past several decades and all. So our reliance on submarine cables have become only more and more in the past few decades. Secondly, why submarine cables are important for your communication, despite having multi-million-dollar projects on satellites that we have all over the world, most of the countries have it, are 2 reasons. One is the latency that the submarine cable provide, because the time limit which otherwise satellite would take, for the information to receive and transfer back is quite reduced when you talk about transferring through submarine cables. Second thing is the bandwidth that submarine cables provide. So the kind of bandwidth you get from data transfer through submarines is way more multiplied times than you get in satellites. And thirdly, the redundancy factor that submarine cables provide. So even if one of the cables cut down, the wires are spread out like that even one of them are damaged. The data can be quickly rerouted through the adjacent cable. So I think these are factors why submarine cables are so important in the present times, given our reliance on our financial connectivity and internet globally. Coming back to your major question, that why it is so important in Indian Ocean context. For that, we need to also realize, as you started with your conversation with that 99% of our global data is carried by submarine cables. So basically, you are dependent entirely on submarine cables for your international data traffic. So in Indian Ocean context, it is at least 95%, if not more, when we talk about the data transfer. And because of that, because our data sovereignty is reliant on it, economic resilience is dependent, geopolitical influence that we are seeking through, fintech and other digital India programs that we have are all reliant on submarine cables. And therefore, for India, it is very important. Having said that, till now, India had only 7 landing stations, which are now going to be, I think, 18 or 19. And within the next few years, we'll have 19 cable landing stations. So the kind of multiplication of the infrastructure as well as the data which is being laid in on it is immense. Another point that is now added is the geostrategic importance of choke points, because most of these data cables pass through the choke points. And as we have already noticed in the Red Sea crisis, how important choke points can be controlled by one single hostile party. So overall, this is a picture of why Indian Ocean looks so important, because we are covered with at least 8 choke points, both towards our left and right of Indian Ocean, towards east and west, if you talk about. And any such damage to our cable system or the landing system can impact our economy, our finances, our everyday usage of internet connectivity in a big way. So I think that summarizes the need for the protection of submarine cables.
Right. No, thank you so much. And it's interesting that you categorize the importance into, well, one, why is there a general preference for subsea cables over satellite communication? And then you enlisted the reasons for the geostrategic importance, and also how almost the entirety of our digital ambition is underpinned by how well and these
secure
cables, secure these subsea cables are. But it's interesting that, so you mentioned that 99% of global traffic, data traffic, travels through the internet, and we are increasingly a very fast growing digital economy. And I just have some stats which say that India consumes about 20% of global internet traffic, but we constitute just 2% of global subsea traffic. And even with the 18, 19 landing stations that we'll have, right now I think we're close to 17, and then we'll reach 18, 19 in a couple of years. But even with that, we only will have 3% of cables land in the country. So there seems to be a mismatch between how much we rely on digital services and our digital ambitions, and then how much we participate and what is our footprint in the global cable network. Do you agree that there is a mismatch in how fast we're growing as a digital economy and how much we're participating in the global cable network?
Absolutely. I think that's a very good way of numerically putting in terms of how, as a country, as a consumer country and a producer country of so much of internet data, we do not have that much of bandwidth when it comes to infrastructure. And it was very much limited either to Mumbai or to Chennai ports, and there most of the your submarine landing station cable stations were. Now, having realized that our consumption and production of internet data is so huge, and one cannot just rely on the public, infrastructure. A lot of private entities have actually now, jumped in the entire thing. So you have Airtel and you have other companies, Geo and others who are now trying to build up that. Having said that, it's not easy to develop that infrastructure. It's expensive, prohibitively expensive as in terms of infrastructure building. Second thing is the kind of raw materials for cable building comes from very few countries. The technology is also acquired by only few countries. So basically, presently, you are dependent, even if you want to expand your infrastructure, physical infrastructure of cables, you are dependent on other countries for the raw materials, for the technology, and presently we are either it's UAE or Japan or, or some of the European countries who are helping us out in that. But that is not a long-term sustainable model. And that's why I think we need to internalize some of those models and start developing those models within the country to have, to overcome that kind of mismatch between the production consumption and the infrastructure.
Right. No, it's interesting. I'm actually interested in understanding what our current capabilities are, because it's clear that we're not dominant players in the industry, not as of yet. It's been Subcom and Alcatel and an NEC or an HMN, and now even hyperscalers are participating in this industry. And with hyperscalers participating in the industry, the share of the pie shrinks further, and the opportunity to get a hold of that share will also shrink, because with the kind of capital that these hyperscalers bring with themselves.
Absolutely.
But we do have, like you mentioned, Sifi, Jio, Airtel, and Tata, and other smaller partners. But and they I think participate in the industry through the consortium model.
Absolutely.
So could you help us understand what is a consortium? How does it actually work in practice? What does it mean to be part of a consortia, and what's the ownership and the investment and the control like in when you're participating in a consortia?
Okay, so most of these technologies, when it comes to submarine cables, are acquired by few of the countries. As I mentioned, Australia is one of them, Singapore, and some of the American companies are now that hold that kind of technology know-how as well as the kind of infrastructure that is required. So there are 2-3 reasons why consortiums are there. First of all, there's the jurisdictional needs. Because if you're entering into another country, you need to know the market, you need to know the consumption pattern and everything. And certain countries do not allow direct entry into your market, so you need to have a partner. That is one reason, the jurisdictional. Another one is the capital intensive nature of the entire business. It is, as I said, it's a prohibitively expensive. No country or no single company can afford to build an entire network of its own. Even if it's hyperscalers, they try and look for smaller partners in terms of building that kind of partnership and reduce the risk patterns which can emerge out of having these transcontinental networks. And also then it is also a win-win situation, because you get international access. The domestic parties get international access in terms of communication. These are transnational, so you need to know the global systems as well. I think for all the good reasons, consortiums make more sense for countries where with certain parties are not as rich, or in terms of technology they are not at a high end. So this helps them to build up that kind of network. On the other hand, there is a mismatch in terms of kind of share that they get. So if you are talking a consortium with hyperscalers like Metas or Amazons, they would have a different kind of approach towards business style, which sometimes agrees or sometimes also disagrees with the present markets, whether you talk about India or rest of the country in the global south. So we have seen certain frictions there. So these are the overall things that consortiums are important, but at the individual domestic level, how you deal with them is also very crucial part in understanding and about entire infrastructure.
Right. And are these consortia essentially regional in nature? So let's say, is like are the world oceans divided into segments by these consortia, and is that how it runs, or is it basically just interest based or part sort of alignment based? So we know that certain players are interested in the economy of a particular region, and so they just form a consortia. How does this work?
See, most of these, the initial, the big ones, existing ones are regional
Mm-hmm.
because it's more about the data traffic moving up between 2, 3 countries. So as you mentioned that we had IAX, and India Europe Express, and all these, CME V6 and IXE. So there are 2, 3, like I can name more. There are few of them which are basically more regional in nature, which operate basically on the market needs. But there are now hyperscalers which are actually going across, transatlantic and trans-Pacific partnerships and trying to build a larger network. So I think with both the models exist presently.
Right, right. Okay. Another issue that I think you mentioned is how we're also dependent on components that form the undersea cables. I mean, components that are used to basically lay these cables. So there are a lot of, you listed that there are dependencies in that. So, for example, the fiber optic cable, that's also made by a very few selected players, mostly Japan, US, and now we're increasingly seeing China in the mix. And then there are repeaters which basically amplify the signals received over multiple kilometers. They are also they are further built by like a smaller group of firms, um, and 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 then there is the bigger the biggest sort of component, which is a cable laying ship, which India does not own any. So there are these dependencies, and these issues are also brought up in highlighting how there's also a concern about sovereignty and security when it comes to subsea cables. So where are you sourcing these equipments from these components of subsea cables from? And with increased participation of China, I think more and more concern has started being raised, and a lot of countries, including the US, have sounded alarm on how rapidly China's footprint is expanding in the global cable network. Do you think that these two issues of sovereignty and the China factor are related, and how real is the threat that um, that supposedly that is coming out of China's increased footprint, particularly for India and its neighborhood?
Yeah, I think this is a very important question to be asked. And why I would say these two questions are questions of concern to two different parties. Um, First of all, most of the cable laying, owning, operating companies are private companies. All right. For them, the scale of the business matters. So they will try and seek the cheapest of the raw materials and cheapest of the ways of having the hardwares installed and everything. In that sense, they will rather go for a company in China rather than a company in the US, which has more stringent, frameworks for hardware development as well as the maintenance and everything. What my conversations have revealed to me in the past few years is the companies do not like they are less likely to be concerned about the sovereignty issues and everything. They are more about how can you scale up your business, how can you earn more money, which is a very very typical commercial way of thinking. The question of sovereignty, question of espionage, question of this using the cables for um, for underscaling your national security interests. Something is a concern of the countries on sovereign nations, and they are the ones that raise these concerns that if the cable is coming in from a particular material is coming from a particular country, are we sure that it could be trusted? And that's why the entire debate of trusted networks came into existence in the last few years. That we need to develop these trusted networks where we know from where the raw materials are coming, what are their standard of operations, what are their legal operational frameworks looking like? Do they have some kind of stringent frameworks in terms of you're not, doing any kind of espionage, any kind of activity which can impact national security? So these two conversations come at from two different ends. And that is the entire problem here, because even when the submarine cables were attacked in the recent times, when we saw in the Europe and everywhere elsewhere, the concern for um, business community or the submarine cable community was more about how do we build redundancy, how do we build more submarine cables. They were not concerned that some espionage must have taken place or something. Espionage was the concern for the countries who were involved, who were affected by the entire thing.
Right.
So yeah, that is a problem. This same conversation takes place at two different times and in two different forms.
Yeah. No, that's really helpful. Thank you, Dr. Bhatt. I wanted to dig in a little deeper on the trusted networks point that you highlighted. So there seems to be the need for countries to find other like-minded countries who they can trust, who also have a significant amount of capability when it comes to subsea cable infrastructure, and then build these shared networks. I would like you to speak more about what these networks entail and what they constitute. So is it just agreements between governments, or would it then also entail, because like you said, these private industry players that majorly run the entire subsea cable network, they wouldn't be concerned with issues that sovereign states have to grapple with. But states will have to speak with the industry and somehow align them and bring them into the fold of trusted networks. So one is, if you could elaborate a little bit on what these trusted networks could entail. And I've read some of your work on how you think that India can partner with Australia, because it has sort of the same concerns about China's presence in the Pacific, and how quickly it's expanding its digital footprint, especially for Pacific countries. So if you could also speak a little bit about how Australia, India are positioned to build some sort of a trusted network when it comes to subsea cables.
See, there are, again, I'll just go back to some of the conversations we started with. That three, four ways of building trusted networks. First of all, you need to know your like-minded partners and their ambitions and their interests, so that you are aware of where you both stand in terms of submarine cable laying, infrastructure building, and the communication part of it. And therefore you should be very clear about where one is procuring their raw materials, how the entire process goes through, who are the elements involved in it, the companies who are involved, are they trustworthy. That is a hardware part of it, laying part of it. Then we also come at as I said, jurisdictional understanding of the thing. And now what we have understood is different countries see their submarine going through different. So basically, in maritime domain, you have high seas and you have jurisdictional waters, right? So, and different countries treat their jurisdictional waters and high seas and exclusive economic zones, which is like 200 nautical miles from your baseline, in different ways. So, one of the suggestions that I thought would be very interesting to read from Australia was that how they have converted their exclusive economic zone to protect their submarine cables, because exclusive zone otherwise generally means exploration of your economic resources, whether fishing or whatever. Right. What they use that particular unclosed United Nations Convention of the Law of the Seas ruling for your EEZs was to protect your submarine cable, because it's an economic infrastructure. You can very well protect your those infrastructure within your EEZ, and that will allow you to have certain kind of control within your EEZ. And that is a very, very, very innovative thinking. So one of the ways that I was thinking was, why not other countries where EEZs are very much prone to external party interference, to go for the similar kind of legal framework under the larger international framework. So that is a legal way of doing things, that you talk to your partners and you try to build similar jurisdictional norms for your region. This is another. Third one I would be talking about is repair system that you also discussed, that, repairing, most of the countries don't have the repair ships, and the repair ships come very expensive. The entire training process is known to very less number of people, so we don't have enough people. How do you train the people at to repair these kind of ship and laying the cables and all that? All of this, every component of it can be a area where the countries can collaborate, cooperate with their trusted partners. And this trust will only be developed when you know your like-minded partner has a similar wavelength of thinking on the issues as you have.
Right, right. So, about the regulatory framework and the supporting policy framework, the what Australia has done with its EEZ, I think it's really impressive, and they have 3 zones that, and I think it's one of a kind when it comes to other like legislative frameworks for subsea cable protection around the world, and I think India can take a leaf out of that book. But in your conversations with stakeholders in India, has this ever come up? Has the Australian approach been considered ever? Because I know that India and Australia do cooperate under Quad, and I'll come to Quad separately also. But and I'm aware that there were a set of guidelines that had come a couple of years ago that were released by TRI, and there were quite a lot of reforms suggested when it came to how we look at the cable infrastructure. So, was there ever a discussion about learning from Australia, or maybe collaborating with them within the Indian stakeholder ecosystem?
Yes. So around the time I had written this paper, I think I did it in 2021 or 22 when I was writing this paper.
Yeah.
And after that, we had this closed door session with some of the senior officials in India who are closely associated in working with telecom ministry, TRI and all that. And I think that idea was already being discussed. So I think there was some kind of thinking that had already initiated some years back that Australian model can be very well be replicated. I think when it comes to policy making side, I think there is already a thinking that how do we operationalize these kind of legal jurisdictional issues. On the other hand, I think business community is more concerned about replicating the redundancy part. So how do you put more submarine cables to provide kind of redundancy in? So I think there are 2 different conversations going on at the same time presently.
Right. No, thank you for that. Because we have sort of brought in Australia into the conversation, I also want to now move to Quad, and that'll help us look at the issue from a regional perspective. So Quad launched the Partnership for Cable Connectivity and Resilience in 23, and it was a big thing because 4 major democracies of the Indo-Pacific acknowledging that cable infrastructure is strategic priority in the region. And then Australia also followed it up with launching a Cable Connectivity and Resilience Center, I think, which is funding a lot of the networks now, cable networks in the Pacific. So in Micronesia, in Kiribati and Nauru, I think the Connectivity and Resilience Center is playing an active role. And then there was a tripartite agreement that the US, Japan, and Australia had also announced. But India, for some reason, has, in my understanding, has been a silent participant, or has been relatively quieter when it comes to the cable agenda. It did not endorse the New York principles when they came out. But there was a joint statement just with the US that came out in 2024, which India was a part of. And like you mentioned, that there have been these policy dialogues where consideration has been given to reforming and learning from Quad partners when it comes to subsea cables. But how do you look at the work that has taken place under Quad? And despite there being these 4 anchors in the Indo-Pacific, why hasn't? It's the work that they have undertaken on subsea cables is not as impressive as it should have been, or it could have been, given Japan and US lead in when it comes to technical capabilities. Australia is leading in the legislative framework, and India is one of the fastest growing digital economy. So they have unique capabilities, but there's not been enough. In my understanding, the work is not. It does not speak to the credential of the grouping. So how do you look at Quad's approach, and what are some of the highlights that you think the group has been able to achieve?
See, I think this is a multi-layered question again. First of all, we have to see the situation of Quad itself in the present geopolitics.
Yeah.
And since we have not been, India was supposed to host last Quad summit, and we couldn't do that because of the geopolitical tensions going on. I think that speaks a lot on for how, several of the initiatives which started with so much of Jing Bang could not be achieved. And I think we should not be disappointed by this, because I think everything else has been impacted under Quad. Having said that, the kind of partnership that Quad actually initiated, the cable connectivity and resilience partnership that was initiated by Quad Leaders Summit, or the kind of centers that we just spoke of, one being in Australia. I think there is work going on under the table, which is not much proper, given that kind of media attention at the moment. There is a certain kind of movement in terms of every country is now trying to build up their own infrastructure when it comes to the submarine cable protection. And with the entire, US-Iran war and Ukraine-Russia war that we've seen recently, I think countries have realized that how much the self-reliance on certain technologies is also important, as much as it is important to have connectivity partners, right? So in that regard, every country is trying to build their hardware infrastructure, software infrastructure, legal infrastructure, jurisdictional infrastructure, operational infrastructure. I think each of the countries are trying to build. In this regard, if you see that why India did not participate in US, Japan, Australia conversation on in submarine cables, was one of the kind of standards these countries were seeking. Because as we have discussed, that US already has this entire existing infrastructure of submarine cables, so does Australia and Japan. So they already have this high level of standards in terms of how it has to be done. India is still catching up on that. So you cannot commit to something which you exactly are right now do not have in place, right? So I think one of the reasons why I would assume that India would have shied from the being a part of such a conversation at this stage is that you're trying to set your own house in order.
Right.
And overall, I think maybe once the entire war scenarios, mellows down a bit and we are much better space, and maybe if Quad starts speaking again at a leader level or minister level, which we should expect in some time, maybe a year or so, I think we'll bring that focus back to the quadrilateral cooperation on submarine cables. I think till the time there will be only bilateral conversation that will happen, or domestic conversation that will take place. So I think every country is trying to use this time or bid this time to build their own networks.
Right. Yeah, no, that's helpful. And beyond the Quad, so you mentioned that there are conversations that are not yet public, but that are still taking place, and that's reassuring right now. And you also mentioned that bilaterally also conversations are taking place between countries, and then there is also there's also keenness in countries to build their own capabilities domestically. But if India were to look beyond Quad, what were some areas or partners in the region that they could look at outside the Quad? So I know that India and Africa have the same trajectory when it comes to economic growth and how digital services have expanded. Could could these two India as a sort of subcontinental landmass in Africa as a continent partner for subsea cables? But I don't know if there are if there's a real opportunity there, because African players in the subsea cable networks are again fewer and fewer than India.
Yeah, absolutely. And that is a reason we do not have that kind of communication yet. So entire communication presently on a submarine cables is driven by what is your what is that data I'm not getting that. So the amount of data being transferred in a particular nodes.
Yeah.
The more complex your nodes are, more communication, more communication you're having. So because India has more, data cables and nodes transferring through us, ASEAN countries and Singapore, as well as Australia, our communication with them is more. And therefore, chances of bilateral and regional partnership with ASEAN countries or with Australia and Pacific countries still more than when we talk about Africa. Though Africa is a great market, for some reason, for very practical reason, India do not have that kind of submarine cable infrastructure presence in Africa. So to start that conversation, you need to have that kind of infrastructure present. To have that kind of infrastructure, you need to show the kind of need that the data transfer between India and Africa has. I think that kind of need has started to show up now, and communication that why these two countries and continents basically have that kind of data transfer, and they need more infrastructure. I think that communication will be only helpful in promoting the infrastructure, because no country is building the infrastructure. It is the private players who are building the infrastructure. So you need to communicate to private enterprises that, please build some networks to African nation, so that we can have this kind of digital communication on submarine cables and protection, and, regional governance on submarine cables happening with them. So it all follows one step after another.
Right. And I think it might take place in a couple of years, or at least like within the next decade, because India and Africa are the two regions that are receiving the most amount of data center investment, and
absolutely
a lot of cable networks, especially hyperscalers, because of the investments that are being made in data center capacity in these two regions. They're starting to build. So there is the Waterworth project and the Two Africa project, and there is the Omajo project that basically contours the entire continent of Africa. So I think with these cables, there will be more opportunity for India and Africa also to speak on cable connectivities between these two land masses. And conversations in the tech space have been have looked at a lot of South-South collaboration when it comes to AI infrastructure. And if we were to extend the AI infrastructure to subsea cables, and I think it follows from that. But I wanted to ask you, so there aren't any, or are there? I'm just thinking out loud and saying, asking questions directly. But how is the international legal framework? How does it deal with subsea cables? Because I understand that the UNCLOS does not explicitly mention what you should be doing with subsea cables and how countries should protect them. There are references to, well, like you said, protecting economic activity in your EEZ, but that also applies to fishing. And then there are certain obligations, and when it comes to the high seas. So, but how do international frameworks look at subsea cables? If you could talk a little bit about that, and what is the role of? There's also an ITU advisory committee on subsea cables. Then there is the ICPC. So, what are these bodies exactly, and do they speak to these consortia? Do they speak to the private industry? Are they advising the government? What is the role of these bodies?
In terms of international and regional governance, as you rightly mentioned, largely the maritime domain and everything in it is actually governed by UNCLOS. And UNCLOS does provide some starting conversation, because we have to understand UNCLOS also was adopted in 1980s and negotiated before that. So that was not the high time for submarine cables conversation. Despite that, it was it was prophetic in its nature. Basically, it was talking about how countries can lay submarine cables within their jurisdictional waters and high seas, and they can protect it. It just gives a very, very broad framework of conversation. However, it is not very pointed that how do countries go on protecting, and what are the various modes? Can high seas be governed by the individual countries, which otherwise are not? So how do you go about it? Those information not given. So this is something open to interpretation by the countries, where countries should come in, start discussing how to use UNCLOS, not only at domestic level, but also for the conversation on conservation of your submarine cables at regional level with other countries, and at the global level also. This provides a very fertile ground of conversation for countries. Second, now coming to the already existing organization, talked about ICPC and you spoke about ITO advisory. These are actually formed out of the consortiums. If you see ICPC is entirely an intergovernmental organization where more and more private players are a party more than the governments. Very few governments are a party of it. In fact, from India, it was initially when I last read, it was only Tata Communication that was a party to it. Not even the Indian government was a party. Unlike Japan and the US, if you see the list of party members to ICPC. So when you don't have adequate representation of your government within these kind of institution which solely govern the submarine cable and related infrastructure, you don't have much a say. I think one of the thinking point here should be how do we increase our participation in these kind of governance level bodies which are directly indirectly impacting you, and now it's directly impacting you.
Right.
One is that. But then ITO advisory, actually, when I read it, they are more prescriptive in nature than giving any kind of safeguard mechanisms. They are saying submarine cable should be protected and broader framework. But when it comes to, they are very clear that if there is a submarine cable issue involving two or more countries in a conflict, they will stay out of it. So you understand, right? There are bodies, but if you unpack those bodies, they are not sufficient enough for the protection of submarine cables at the present moment.
Right. So countries will have to come up with their own domestic legislative frameworks, drawing from whatever rough contours that the advisory committee,
absolutely,
okay. That brings me to the last question for the podcast. If we've gone over the entire range of issues when it comes to subsea cables, why they're important, what is the current level of participation by Indian players, what is holding them back, what is the biggest threat when it comes to subsea cables, and like we should be looking at like-minded partners. But if you were advising the Indian government, and we've also sort of established that it will fall down, it will be incumbent on the governments to take this up and support the cable infrastructure in the country and in the region. So if you were advising the government today on just one single thing that makes that would propel the domestic subsea cable industry, what would be the one thing that you would highlight as a priority or as the first step or as an enabler right now to accelerate our participation?
I think this was the same advice I gave a few years back, and I'm sure it is in the line somewhere. And we cannot speak of it because submarine cables being critical infrastructure, we don't get to know what is happening about it. But one of the crucial starting point is to define submarine cables as your, where do you stand with your submarine cables? What is your, as I said, jurisdictional understanding of the submarine cables, your operational infrastructure of the submarine cables, how you're going to protect it. Make it very clear in terms at the domestic level that which like what is your infrastructure related to your thinking related to submarine cables is, and what are the bodies which will be involved in protection and laying and entire from 0 to 10, everything has to be taken care of, which all the bodies. These clarifications have to be very, very upfront in front of people, because one, it's clear. What we have realized is when the con parties come, they're basically scrambling to know that which is the right body we should be speaking to when it comes to submarine cable laying, protection, other issues. So that infrastructure is right now not present because we are not yet, we are yet to understand the importance of submarine cables, or we are doing it but very, very clandestine level. The conversations do not take place on a very general level. People are not aware. So I think that kind of conversation should be a very starting point, that where do we stand with our submarine cables and which our bodies are going to take care of. Then once that is in place, you can take it further from there.
Right. So a more forthcoming approach, disclosing what the approach of the government is, and then and some sort of a transparency by sharing information with relevant stakeholders so that they also know who to approach and
Absolutely.
who to speak to.
Yeah.
Right. That's really helpful and that's really insightful. Thank you so much, Dr. Bhatt, for a very, very insightful and informative conversation. With that, we come to an end of this episode. I'd like to thank you for taking out the time for speaking with us. We'll be back in 2 weeks with a new episode. To our listeners, if you want to make sure that you don't miss any of Interpreting India's episodes, be sure to subscribe on Apple Podcasts or Spotify or wherever you get your podcasts from. And to learn more about our research and our team, you can visit us at carnegieindia.org. And you can also find us on social media on X, Facebook, LinkedIn, and Instagram. Thank you once again, Dr. Pooja.
You're welcome. I'm very happy to discuss about this issue today with you, Charukeshi. Thank you, Carnegie, for having me on today.
Thank you.